Hey everybody, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, August 5th, where we are talking about our second speech, which is the informative speech. So you should have already posted your first speech, which was the 5-minute autobiographical. And what I will be doing is viewing that speech and then giving you feedback with that speech. If you haven't already sent me your speaking outline, please do so via email so that I can evaluate that as well. And as I indicated, we are going to be preparing for our second speech. So I wanted to talk about informative speeches and visual media. And I also wanted to talk about supporting materials, even though you don't need to use outside resources for this particular speech, but you might elect to do so because you might want additional information. You will be using outside resources for your third and your final speech, and that happens to be the persuasive speech. So if you don't use this information now, you can certainly use this information in the future. And what we will be doing next class is having quiz number 2. It'll be very similar to what you did with quiz number 1. It'll be 20 questions, mostly short answer, but some true, false, and some multiple choice. And it'll be based on the videos and the textbook reading. It'll be open book, open notes, and you'll have 24 hours in which to complete that examination and send it to my email. Again, that's Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And also what I will be doing next class is posting some student sample informative speeches, very similar to what I did with the autobiographical speeches, speeches that are on YouTube but are in no way connected with GCC, and asking you to give feedback on those speeches, and hopefully those speeches also will give you an idea of how you could proceed with your own informative speech, which you will be delivering on August 12th, which is a Thursday. So prior to August 12th, the Thursday, please contact me for a practice session, whether you want to do so via Zoom or phone, chat, or email. But in one way or another, I want to touch base with each of you about what your thoughts are for your second speech. And if there's any way that I can assist you with your second speech, certainly I will do that as well. And again, that second speech is a 10-minute informative speech. So we are doubling the time at this particular instance. And the way that it's going to be different from the first speech is that I'm going to ask you to use at least one audio or visual aid. So that's something that we will be talking about today. Certainly it's something you could have done with your first speech, but I didn't want you to have to be concerned about audio visuals when you were also thinking about the beginning elements of speeches, such as putting together an introduction or a conclusion or breathing deeply. And as I indicated, I'm using the template that I included in our class syllabus for that first speech for evaluation. But for the second and the third speech, I just merely take notes of strengths and weaknesses of the speeches. And talking about strengths and weaknesses, that's going to be today's attendance question, by the way, is that I'm going to ask you to view the speeches of your classmates and to send me via email a strength or weakness of each of those speeches. There are only 3 students in class, so it's a rather small class. One of you indicated that you will be posting your speech on Thursday at 9 a.m., Thursday, August 5th. So you'll probably want to wait until after 9 a.m. on Thursday so you have the whole of the class. And what I wanted you to do was to view those speeches and send me one strength or one weakness via email. My email is ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, and I will compile all of that, and then I will be posting that so that you can see your classmates' responses to the speeches as well. So, as you know, we are delivering a 10-minute informative speech, and that's going to be due on August 12th, Thursday, where you are using at least one audio or visual aid. If it turns out that you want to deliver that speech via Zoom, please contact me. I'm assuming that you all want to upload your speech as you do with speech number 1. So what I will be doing is I will be posting an area at the top of our Moodle site for speech number 2 when the time comes so that you can post your particular speech in that area. So for informative speeches, which is chapter 12 of the textbook, or at least the edition that I had ordered for us, um, basically your job is to try to teach the audience in 10 minutes. And on page 196, they give suggestions about things that you could teach an audience about. You could talk about famous people. You could talk about places. You could talk about things, events, ideas, or procedures. And you might want to consider your first speech. And was there anything in your first speech that you could turn into an informative speech? Not that you necessarily have to. I usually suggest that for your informative speech that you choose a subject that you already have some familiarity with, so you don't have to spend a lot of time teaching yourself before you teach us. But certainly the choice is yours. So if you wanted to learn something new and then share that information with us, you can. But my suspicion is that, particularly with a condensed class, such as a summer class, that what would make the most sense is that you already talk about something that you have some knowledge base. And you can either give us a speech of explanation, in other words, you're telling us something, or a speech of demonstration, and you're showing us how to do something, or perhaps a combination of the two. They each have their strengths and weaknesses. But what I do suggest, regardless of how you proceed, is that you limit your points, not only because you have just 10 minutes, but also because, if you'll remember, we talked about how notoriously poor individuals' memories are and their attention spans are. That you use transitions, a way to go from one point to another. That you avoid jargon or highly technical knowledge. You're assuming a rather general audience. That you are clustering or grouping like ideas. Again, that's a memory technique, clustering, that we oftentimes do. That you associate the new concepts with older concepts. Again, that's another memory technique that oftentimes is utilized by teachers. You use repetition, probably more so than you would use in writing, because basically, again, we have poor memories and poor attention spans. That you address different learning styles. So if there are different ways that you can present the information, is one of the reasons why I'm asking you to use an audio or a visual, so that you can utilize another learning style. If you'll notice that in addition to these videos, I also put the notes of main points underneath the videos. And one of the reasons why is, again, because of learning styles. Some people learn better orally, and in other words, they would probably get more from the class by listening to the videos. But other individuals learn through text, and they might get more out of the class by actually reading the text itself, the notes below the videos. What I suggest, of course, is that you combine the two, because the more exposure you have to the information, then the more likely it is that you are going to retain that information and understand that information. And you may need to motivate your audience in order for your audience to be interested in your topic. It could be a topic that your audience already has some inherent interest in, but it could very easily be a topic that your audience doesn't necessarily have interest in. I think I shared with you the speech that I heard in one of my classes about the Heimlich maneuver, where what the speaker did was they actually simulated a choking in class, unbeknownst to me or anyone else in the class. So afterwards, when we realized that it wasn't a real episode, the individual introduced his topic, which was the Heimlich maneuver. And of course, we had high investment, high motivation in learning about this particular topic, because just a few minutes previous, we had been in a situation where we thought we would actually have to utilize the Heimlich maneuver. So I know that oftentimes what ends up happening is that you need to motivate an audience if you've got an audience for a long period of time, let's say over the course of a semester, which is what our own textbook was trying to do in chapter 1, by trying to talk about all of the ways that public speaking and rhetoric are important in not just an academic setting, but in our daily lives as well. So they were trying to motivate us for the rest of the semester. 10 minutes, again, goes very quickly. So I don't think you necessarily have to spend as much time concerned about motivation as you do about clearly expressing your points. And less is more. So what you might find is that your topic is rather complex. Most topics are, and what you're going to need to do is simplify. And you may even need to tell your audience that the topic is much more complex than the way you're presenting it, but because of the limitations of time, you wanted to at least address this particular piece of it. Now, using that visual media, you can be anywhere from low tech to high tech. Low tech would be something like using a whiteboard, and high tech, I would think about something like a computer technology. Of course, things are slightly more challenging now that we are likely presenting via video, although you do have the option of presenting via Zoom if you wanted to. But regardless of what you present, if you present something like a picture, which works very well for motivating an individual emotionally, or if you wanted to present something like a statistic, which works very well for motivating an individual intellectually, you do have to think about who your audience is and what would be best for presentation for that particular audience. You want to be audience centered. You want to think about your topic and what would be the best way to present, what would be the best audio visual to present for your particular topic. And you also want to think about your own comfort level as well. So certainly, you could show a picture, let's say, but how are you going to be displaying that picture? Again, if you are recording yourself, it could be something as simple as just holding the picture up to the camera so that we can see. The same if you decided to use a poster. Keep in mind that everything should be done professionally. So the days of just sort of scribbling something on a piece of paper are pretty much over. You can use a prop where you are actually showing something. And we saw that with the sample first speeches, with the speech from the gentleman who indicated he wanted to be a millionaire, and he had props, and which was a wonderful way to engage audience. The difficulty was the way he engaged, or I should say did not engage with those props, in that basically he never really looked at them or interacted with them. His presentation was very stiff and very monotone, and my suspicion was that he was reading his presentation. Again, I wasn't there, so I don't know necessarily, but I wouldn't at all be surprised if he had taped the text onto his on behind the camera, or onto his opposite wall, and was basically just reading the text. So if you're using props, you definitely want to interact with them. And again, you have to think about things like size and scale. Is it something that's going to be visible to your particular audience? You can use video or audio clips. And again, you're going to have to think about how you would go about integrating that if you are actually filming yourself. And also, you need to think about balance. This is a 10-minute speech. So I would say approximately 2 to 3 minutes of audio visual, no more than that. So certainly you don't want to have 10 minutes of a video or audio clip for a 10-minute speech. If you were giving an hour speech, then certainly you could do something like that. But the idea is that regardless of what audio or visual you choose, that is supposed to supplement your performance, not replace your performance. We don't want the audio or visual to be presenting the speech. We want you to be presenting the speech. So you want to make sure that you are you are visible, and you are front and center when you are delivering that particular speech. I don't know if you've ever heard of a flip chart. Basically, it's a large pad of paper where the speaker decides when to reveal new pieces of information. You can kind of think about it as a pre-PowerPoint, because it shared many of the same similarities that makes PowerPoint so appealing, is that you as a speaker get to decide when to reveal that information to your particular audience. You can do something like Zoom screen sharing. There's a lot of options that you've got in terms of visual media. Most times people think initially PowerPoint, and I have no problems with PowerPoint, but again, you need to use PowerPoint well. You can't have the PowerPoint replace your particular presentation. You want to be front and center, not the PowerPoint. And certainly when you are delivering live, you've probably seen what I call PowerPoint gone wrong, where you've got an individual who either is reading their PowerPoint slides, more often than not in a monotone, which is even worse, or you've got too much text on the PowerPoint slides. So basically it's too visually busy for the audience to be able to appreciate them, or there's some sort of mechanical or technical difficulty. And again, if you are delivering live, you can't necessarily reschedule the speech for another time. You're going to have to address that technical difficulty to the best of your ability. And the test isn't necessarily whether or not you can deliver a speech without any technical glitches. The test is whether or not you can deliver a speech in spite of technical glitches. So if your PowerPoint slides don't work, the idea is that you can transition off into another audio visual. Perhaps something just as simple as using a whiteboard, which works very well for just notating things quickly. And that would suffice in that particular instance. So, but do remember that regardless of what audio or visual you're using, you do want to be professional. You do want to test your equipment beforehand. You do want to plan a backup. And I suggest that if you are using your PowerPoint slides as an outline, which some people like to do, that you make sure you print up that information for yourself prior to delivering the speech. Because if you are relying on the actual PowerPoint itself and there's some sort of technical difficulty, not only have you lost your PowerPoint presentation, but then you've also lost your speaking notes because that you were relying on them being displayed through PowerPoint. So at least if you had a paper copy, you would at least have something in front of you. Charts and numbers work very well for appealing to people's intellect. And charts are a great way for being able to present numbers. Numbers tend to be rather abstract, and you've probably seen lots of different ways that you can use charts, whether you've got a pie chart or a bar graph chart. So there's lots of different ways that you could go about giving a visual presentation of numbers. Pictures work very well with emotions, and we tend to be a combination of the two. We are obviously intellectual beings, but we are probably more motivated by emotion. And if you've ever heard of a consultant by the name of Frank Luntz, he's someone I talk about in my media and popular culture classes. He talks a little bit about how individuals, as proud as they are of their intellect, more often than not are motivated by their emotions. And he's made a very lucrative career out of doing that, out of finding language that appeals to people's emotions. And he's responsible for terms such as the war on terror. He was consulted by politicians, and his response was that it should not be called the war on Iraq or the war on any particular peoples, because there wouldn't be as much buy-in by the American public. Rather, if you called it the war on terror, you'd get a large amount of buy-in because no one really supports terror, while you could support, let's say, a particular group of people. He also was the individual who was responsible for renaming the estate tax to the death tax. The estate tax was pretty non-controversial. And most people supported it without much difficulty because estate sounds wealthy, so it sounded fair that a piece of property would be taxed upon an individual's death. He suggested to politicians that they rename it a death tax because the tax occurs at death. And now all of a sudden something that wasn't controversial becomes very controversial, because now death is something that we all share, and it has nothing to do with wealth, unlike a estate, which has something to do, or at least implies it has something to do with wealth. So what he does is that he tries to find language that appeals or does not appeal to individuals emotionally in order to motivate behavior. So, and we can debate the pros and the cons of his particular approach, but what's clear is that it's rather successful. And there is a documentary called The Persuaders, PBS Frontline, that I show in my media class. And you see him at work working with an electric company, actually, and he's trying to gauge the users' feelings about that electric company. The electric company wants to raise their prices, and his job is to try to come up with language that the electric company can use that the consumers would feel justified for price increases. And basically what he does is he polls and he tests individuals to try to find the language that would be most likely to motivate them. It's quite, he's turned it into a science. It's quite fascinating to see. So in terms of regardless of whatever visual media you decide to use. You want it to be clear, you want it to be simple, you want it to be neat. Again, you want to remember that you are front and center. The visual media is merely supporting you. And I've seen the opposite as well, where sometimes someone has a piece of visual media, a poster, let's say, or a prop, and in the anxiety of the moment, they don't even refer to it. So you want to make sure that you're not ignoring it, but again, you're not using it to replace you. We want to be able to see things like your eye contact and your presentation. Consider scale, again, something that is visible. Consider balance and proportion. Again, no more, I would say, than about 3 minutes or so if you're using a visual such as a piece of video, because you don't want it to replace your presentation. Use color for interest, but again, don't overwhelm us with color. This is a great suggestion for PowerPoint again, or what I call just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. I don't know if you've seen this with PowerPoint where things are just so busy that it's impossible to really pay attention to the content of the PowerPoint because somebody has become so enamored with all of the technical possibilities of PowerPoint that they utilize everything. And note that PowerPoint is just a brand. Prezi is another one as well. And if you are presenting text to your audience, avoid all capitals. Certainly you can capitalize a word or a phrase to emphasize it, but you don't want to put everything in capitals because then it becomes very difficult to read. So in terms of thinking about supporting material, as I had said, you are not required to use outside resources for the second speech. For your informative speech, you can talk about something that you already have some knowledge of. It could be something that perhaps you've learned in another class that you want to share with us. It could be a hobby or an interest that you happen to have. It could be something that you briefly addressed in your in your autobiographical speech that you want to expand upon in your informative speech. So there are lots of different ways that you can go about this. But you can also elect to find information about your particular topic for the informative speech. You are going to need to do this with your third and last speech, which is your persuasive speech, where you are all going to be required to use 3 outside sources. So I thought I would talk about it now rather than later. Certainly you'll use this with your last speech, but also it's something that you might elect to use with this speech, the informative speech. And using supporting material increases your credibility and your persuasiveness. It's one of the reasons why I'm asking you to use outside resources for your third and final speech, because it is a persuasive speech. You want to make sure you're using accurate information. And if most people think of a PowerPoint when they think of audio visuals, they usually think of Google or Wikipedia when they're thinking about supporting material and outside resources. And I have nothing against Google or Wikipedia, but just note that Wikipedia is a rather general site. Think of it as much like the old encyclopedias that individuals could use. It's certainly not as sophisticated in any way. And Google and Wikipedia have the possibility of errors, and especially Google, because the wide open internet, obviously, the advantage is also the same as the disadvantage. Which we also talk about in my media class, is that anybody can post anything and there isn't anybody there to vet or review it. So that means that you need to be particularly cautious as a consumer. You need to verify the information. That's not to say that information can't be manipulated for a book or for a magazine, but at least books and magazines and so forth go through some sort of editorial process. So something that's been published has at least been reviewed in a way that something on the internet has not necessarily been reviewed. So there's a higher probability that you can get inaccurate information. But that said, the internet is probably going to give you the most up-to-date information. Now, as a student, you have the ability to use internet resources that the general public cannot. One of the beauties of the internet is that it's free, obviously. Now, there are resources that you need to pay for that you can access through the internet, and these resources are more trustworthy because they basically have been reviewed by a staff of editors. That said, You, as a college student, do not have to pay for these resources because your college is paying for these resources. In other words, GCC. And usually individuals don't purchase these because it's cost prohibitive. Usually these are large organizations, such as educational institutions. And these are known as databases, which you might have heard of before, that you can access through our library website, the GCC Library. You can see in the notes below, I've indicated the website for the GCC Library. And what you do need is a library card access code to be able to access those resources electronically. So this is my plug for you getting a GCC library card. If you don't already have one, you can do it very easily. If you go onto the GCC library site, you can see there are multiple ways in which you can contact a librarian if you wanted to interact with a librarian, whether it be through phone or chat or email, or if you wanted to just apply for a card, you could just do that electronically and have no kind of interaction with anybody. It takes about a minute or so. So it's not a difficult process at all. And again, what you want is that access code so that you can access the databases. And these are electronic resources that obviously you access through the web, but they are not available to the public. These are only available to educational institutions or to any organizations that pay for them. And these databases cover a wide range of subjects. Some basically are general databases where EBSCOhost, for instance, where they talk about some general topics. Others are devoted to particular disciplines such as medicine or law or literature. Some of them are very useful for particular subjects. So some are related to some of the subjects that are common at GCC, such as criminal justice or art, for instance, and that they've been purchased because of those particular programs at GCC. You can even access things like periodicals and newspapers, including the Recorder, not necessarily in its entirety, but at least in pieces. The New York Times, for instance. So if you're a news junkie, you just might be interested in some of these databases. Children's books databases, databases that are focused on the K through 12 audience. So if you have children in your life, that might be something of interest to you. So it's definitely worth reviewing those databases. And I encourage students to use those databases because, again, there is a certain level of validity associated to the information in those databases. They also offer streaming video, lots of educational documentaries and videos that oftentimes teachers show in their classes. So there's a wealth of information there. So if you are going to be using an outside resource, and you've probably talked about this in previous English classes, well, then you need to document that resource. You need to indicate to your audience that this is not yours. It belongs to someone else. It's their intellectual property. And usually there's a system in place for you to give the details of where that information came from. And there are multiple systems that exist. Oftentimes they're based on the kind of subject that you are examining. So if you are using the MLA system or the Modern Language Association system, then you are using this system for the humanities, which includes things such as public speaking. And there's a particular way to document where somebody's information is coming from. So if you are quoting from someone, then usually what you do in parentheses immediately following that quote is indicate some information about where that quote can be found. The least amount of information necessary for the reader to understand where that quote came from. So usually what that is a page number, but you might have to include additional information if it's unclear based on the way that you have formulated your quotation. You might need to use the author's last name or perhaps even the title of the text and the author's last name if you've got multiple texts by the same author. Again, the idea is to be as simple as possible within the body of your writing itself. And then at the very ending, there's something called a works cited page. And it is indeed all of the works that you have cited, all of the articles and the websites and the magazines and so forth that you have quoted from in your paper. And the way that it's listed is by author, last name, and alphabetical order, with all of the details of things like the publisher and the place of publication. And another system is called the APA system, the American Psychological Association. And this is the system that's used for the sciences. And it has the same intent as the MLA, which is allowing the audience to know when information is not part of the actual author's presentation. It's from an outside resource, and giving the audience or the reader enough information so that they could find that quote or that cited source so they could verify for themselves. But the system for going about documenting is slightly different. And basically, what you do is that you use the system that's correct for that particular discipline. And usually, all of these systems have a certain level of complexity to them, and you need to be very careful about where you put your punctuation, so forth and so on. The good news with public speaking is that you don't have to get that precise nor that detailed. What you want to do is to make sure, certainly, that your audience knows when you are citing something that is not yours, but your audience doesn't want to be overwhelmed with details such as place of publication and publisher. Though, certainly, if you are going to have ethos or ethics, you want to have that information available for your audience. In the event that an audience member were to ask you, then you could provide that information for them. But basically, all you have to do is give what I call a kind of tag. Basically, it's just a way of notifying your audience within the context of the speech that the information that you're sharing is not necessarily yours. It could be as simple as beginning a quotation or a fact that is an outside resource with a phrase like "according to experts." Now, once I've said "according to experts," the assumption is that everything after that is not my original research. It belongs to somebody else. So that at that particular point, that would be enough in order to be able to give your audience a sense of your use of outside resources. And then again, if an audience member were to ask you for additional information, as a good public speaker, you should be prepared and have that information either in your head or on a piece of paper, and then you would be able to share that with your audience. And what I'm going to ask you to do for your third speech is to list your 3 or more resources at the ending of your speaking outline. And again, in the real world, you wouldn't be sharing your speaking outline with anybody. But again, as a workshop situation, I want to see your speaking outline. And then I will also be able to see your 3 resources as well, or as many as you would like to use. And you don't need to list them in any particular format because, again, I want this to be applicable to the real world. The assumption is that if you were presenting to an audience, then a general audience, then they wouldn't necessarily expect you to present your documentation in a MLA style or an APA style, unless you are presenting to a specialized audience. So the idea is that you're just giving the general pieces of information that an audience would need, such as the author and the date and the title and the place of publication. But there isn't any reason why you have to follow a particular format in your speaking outline when you list your resources. So there are lots of different ways to think about resources. They don't necessarily have to be print resources. You can use videos, you can use audios, you can use interviews as well. And if you're using an interview, again, you want to be ethical. You want to think about the person you're interviewing. You want to be clear that they know and understand and have given permission that you can use their information in the way in which you intend to do it in writing or orally. And that if they don't give you your information or they don't give the permission, that you don't share that information. And they might want anonymity, so you might want to give them a pseudonym. And, there's lots of different ways that you can go about presenting information to try to convince an audience. Some of it can be qualitative evidence, which is basically anecdote stories. Some of it can be quantitative, which is facts. And both are very effective. And again, I don't think one is necessarily better than another. We tend to be motivated by both You think about quantitative or facts, it would be something like, what is the transfer rate of this particular school, or what is the graduation rate of this particular college? If you want to think about qualitative, then that would be more like the comments from students about the strengths and weaknesses about the school. And again, there are pros and cons to each of these kinds of evidence gathering techniques. I suggest that you use or try to use a combination of the two. Again, when you get to the point of your persuasive speech, which is 15 minutes, you're using only 3 outside resources, though certainly you could use more. So I'm not going to ask for any a particular combination of resources. So you could use 3 websites if you wanted to, and they could all be quantitative if you wanted. But the idea is that obviously the more research you use, then the more you should try to have a diversification of the types of sources and kinds of research that you're using. And again, you probably will have a mix of primary accounts. Those are firsthand accounts, eyewitness accounts, and secondary accounts. And those are based on primary accounts. Those are based on scholarship. Again, pros and cons to each. You know, the primary or the firsthand accounts, well, somebody's actually, let's say, experienced the situation, let's say a war. So, of course, they have a certain level of expertise because they actually were in the war itself. However, they could be mistaken, they could be misremembering, they could even be lying. So you've got also secondary accounts, which basically are the scholars that have devoted their lives to studying war. So they have a certain level of expertise. But again, they don't necessarily have personal experience with war itself, which is why having both primary and secondary sources can be very useful, just like having both qualitative and quantitative can be very useful, because qualitative or anecdotes, of course, they can be very biased and subjective, but they can also be much more accurate because they basically are based on individual experience. And quantitative can also be manipulated and biased and inaccurate. Numbers can be manipulated just like anything else. So just because you have a particular graduation rate, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could be that your graduation rate is lower out of school because you've got a higher transfer rate. So people are transferring before they graduate, let's say. So, but of course, people want data and facts. So having a combination of the two is very, very useful. So those are the 3 things that I wanted to talk about in terms of the upcoming informative speech. The idea of what an informative speech is, where you're teaching us or showing us about how to do something. I've seen lots of demonstration speeches where you're actually making something like a product. Food is very popular, for instance. It takes a lot of prior planning in order to be able to do something like that. And then, of course, the speech where you basically talk to us and you teach us in that manner, where you're sharing information, or a combination of the two. And then, of course, thinking about the audio visuals, and that you want to use at least one. I stopped counting after one, but use as many as you need in order to give value to your particular speech, as long as, again, they aren't replacing your performance. And then finally, supporting material, which you may not necessarily need for this speech, but you will definitely need for the third speech. And again, for today's attendance question, and I ask that this time, rather than responding to the discussion form, you'll notice it's not posted in the discussion form, I ask that you respond to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And this will be due 24 hours. So this will be Friday, August 6th at 9 a.m. to watch speech number 1, and this is what was posted in the top section of Moodle by your peers, and briefly indicate one strength and one weakness of each of the speeches. And again, there are only 3 people in class, so it's a small class. But again, if you can do that and send that to me, and then I will compile all that data and I will post that next class. What we will be doing next class is having our quiz, and I will also be posting some sample student informative speeches for you to watch and to give some feedback on. I also ask that you contact me prior to speech number 2. So that's going to be prior to the 12th of August, so that we can set up some time to talk about that particular speech. And again, lastly, if you haven't already sent me your speaking outline for speech number 1, please do so. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class talking about, well, informative speeches. Take care. Bye-bye.